Hello again. Okay. So before I took my protein break, I had some walnuts and put collagen in my coffee. It's really good. We were just getting to the Ku Klux Klan after the Civil War. And then my theory was, because we don't have, where there's gaps or where there's anomalies, that's where I have questions. So I'm like, wait, what happened to that Dutch debt? Who paid it? War of 1812, defaulted on a loan to France, got a loan from the Dutch to build an economy that we didn't have functioning 9 years after we became a country. No surprise to anyone in charge. Hello, viewer. So we're talking about the history of the Democratic Party and some Republicans, KKK, and then the history of racism in America. And we were talking about Darwin, and then the aristocracy that surrounded him, where it was the medical field coming up, and then people who wanted to control land or commit genocides to control land would use the medical field to say, and I'm part Aztec, by the way, like native to Yucatan. And so how at that time people were using this moral excuse to say, no, they need us to take their land so we can save the human from the savage, like the Carlisle fella in the Midwest around that same time, who had the theory going that it was a part of saving an indigenous person's humanity to do genocide and to enslave people. Excuse me, that walnut I had, it's very dry. Then we're talking about how it's ironic because in the late 1700s, we have a Black physician named James Durham in New Orleans who studied medicine from childhood, observed human function, had a bit of natural ability, likely because these areas had disease and practiced medicine longer than Europeans did. And so he became very successful at age 21, curing people of yellow fever, cured thousands of people. And then we have Darwin, born in 1809. He's just trying to observe birds. His dad and the Victorian society surrounding him are looking for faith in science, and they start to build this idea of self-importance off the backs of what other scientists were doing, trying to control that narrative to be used for tons of things, not just the genocide, but for centuries of control, publishing, you name it. And then pharmacy is a big one we still see today. And so Britannica, and I put all these links below. Britannica has the Ku Klux Klan forming after the Civil War in the first chapter to the 1870s. And that started, I think, in Kentucky or Tennessee. Again, I was saying my theory was that a certain faction of Dutch people, because they're weird, and then we owed a debt to the Dutch, or some people did, after the War of 1812. And I think that's something that just goes quiet in American history. And so I have questions about that in a major way. And the French, because I don't like, if you default on a loan, would the French ever take that as a real default? History would say no in current times. And so he says that after 1870, or Britannica says that they go quiet, and then they have a resurgence in 1915 to present era. So this is the more northern version. So Minnesota and Wisconsin had the most of the modern era KKK chapters. Minnesota had 700 to 800 KKK chapters, and Wisconsin had a similar affiliation with that. They are the two most economically racist states. The disparity is huge, and then the irony is that there's so much space and opportunity in both states that it in an extra way doesn't make sense. So still relevant there today. And this is something that the people who still want to stand up for Black rights and just really stand against, I would say, the KKK, because they take certain assaults and allegiances with all kinds of ethnic groups. Blacks themselves have been in the gang part of the KKK in relation, so have certain native tribes. And so it's a real melting pot of domestic terrorists nowadays, isn't it? And so if people want to eliminate these factions that have grown quite large, they do hold in their ideologies a lot of monopolies in publishing, pharmacy, government, because they never were ended. It was LBJ, and then people just forgot everything. In 1970, everybody said, "What? We just started making movies." And so, yeah, so they are definitely still in politics. And if people want to eliminate them to that domestic terrorist faction, you do have to litigate and bring people to court, and things have to make sense, and you need historical evidence, and you need to levy all of that evidence for what you're accusing, and you need to get the people right, the places right, the products right. It has to be correct if you want to be serious about it. It is really sad. In the BLM riots, you guys raised like $90 billion. What was it? Something like that. Like $40 billion. And I haven't seen any Black community build anything to further build wealth off of that $80 billion or whatever it was. So no, become the power, because that's what you're entitled to. So everybody's born with inalienable rights, and under God and nature's God, it's self-determination, build the life you want. And if things that are tyrannical block you from building those things, then you take them to court and you levy it all against your historical or present day evidence with your Declaration of Independence. So that's preemption law. The Constitution comes after that. It's a lesser law. The Constitution is below the Declaration of Independence. So yes, you should be embracing your power above those who have been perverting power or using it in a way that is un-American while calling it American. So 1915, we got the second KKK chapter to present day. Woodrow Wilson, wait, is that who it is? Birth of a Nation. They talk about the Bolshevik Revolution here. Oh, wait. Okay, I'm just going to read the Britannica article. So I'm not saying I agree with this, but this is where I'll be at right now because of other things I witnessed in my lifetime and from my family history. Like I said, with the indigenous Yucatan and then the Swedish socialism. And I don't know if he was saving her or enslaving her, because I don't know that history of my great-great-grandma that well. Great-great-grandma. Okay, so revival of the Ku Klux Klan. This is from Britannica, 1915. The 20th century Klan had its roots more directly in the American nativist tradition. It was organized in 1915 near Atlanta, Georgia, also the northern states, by Colonel William J. Simmons, a preacher and promoter of fraternal orders who had been inspired by Thomas Dickens' book, The Klansman, written in 1905. And that was with a C, by the way. Klansman with a C. The D.W. Griffith film, The Birth of a Nation, that's 1915. And the film Birth of a Nation, 1915. The new organization remained small until Edward Y. Clark and Elizabeth Tyler brought to it their talents as publicity agents and fundraisers. Those publishers are still in play today. I doubt their grandkids know how to make a fucking sandwich. The revived clan or they're great people who meant to fight against their parents when they found out, like, oh, because you would lie to your kids and say, no, we just own a newspaper called the Miami Herald, or whatever. The new organization remained small until these publicists, Edward Y. Clark and Elizabeth Tyler, start to be like, ideas. Boy, can we convince people of things. That was their job. The revived clan was fueled partly by patriotism in the way they were narrating it, and partly by not true patriotism, and partly by a romantic nostalgia for the Old South. Oh, these psychologists, publicists, they're so fancy. But more importantly, it expressed the defense reaction of white Protestants, the Dutch, in small town America who felt threatened by the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. Russians are the blacks of white people. And by the large-scale immigration of the previous decades that had changed the ethnic character of these small Dutch towns. It says American society. Very cool that you're listening while at work. I'm trying to get back into 3-3 Vato. I'm trying to get back into teaching how I would when I did Girl Power through the YWCA back in 2013, 2014. Only I was a little hesitant to talk about these things. And it was like because of my lighter skin. I have a lot of European ancestry too, obviously. Your opinions didn't matter compared to the people with darker skin in the group. And they were wrong about like everything. And then they were highly democratic. And it's like, we're supposed to be talking about racism. And you're the fucking Democrat not being like, by the way, I know my party's involvement and this is how I separate myself. So it was actually really hard too. And only on a few occasions did I speak up. And I was like, absolutely not. We had one Ojibwe woman, and I had a group of girls literally from every continent or their ethnic background from every continent. And this Ojibwe woman came in and told them 3rd to 8th grade, she came in and told them, you're not allowed to go to the beach and touch the native rocks and flowers because you're not native. And she went on that same message for an hour. And that was the one time I was like, absolutely fucking not. If we go to the beach, they're picking all the flowers. And it was just the most ridiculous thing. And she did come back to apologize. Her name was Christina. She's Ojibwe, Duluth, Minnesota. The most racist women I have ever met in my life are Ojibwe women. And they're always white as fuck. And I'm like, okay. The first people in the Great Lakes were the Aztecs. Hello. Hola, ¿qué tal? Actually, Mr. Vato, 3-3 Vato, what do you think of that? Because I've done Native history and culture a couple times in college. They don't mention the Aztecs ever, and they keep calling themselves the first people. I'm like, I don't know if you know this, but just like a little bit down south, and for like a few thousand years, the empires were like huge and massive. Like, we gave you guys the horses. Do you not remember? Because the whole origin story for Duluth, Minnesota is 600 years ago, we came from the East Coast through the waters, and this is our homeland. I'm like, oh, you're missing so much there, bud. Yeah, no, we definitely were. And I didn't know that the Missouri or the Mississippi River went all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. I just learned that. Staying at like Airbnbs. And I'm like, oh my God, of course. You go up the water, you go down the water. We're a huge, massive trade network with thousands of years of history. And the Aztecs were so gnarly. And so you would want to get away from people. Also, like a lot of explorers just would go off on their own. So, and that would have been a job to find like new things to trade with and whatever. So just the Ojibwe people of Minnesota need to recognize and get it together. All right, back to the topic at hand. So Protestant America, again, will relate to the Dutch who indebted us federally after the War of 1812. And then this second clan, and that's just where I'm going to land on my analysis today because I have the freedom to do so. This second clan peaked in the 1920s when its membership exceeded 4 million. Let's see what the population of America was in 1920. And I'll say while I'm pointing fingers at a white group, while whites are actively, being persecuted too, is that they would have been against, like I said, the Bolsheviks. So the Dutch would have been very racist to Eastern Europeans. And then just different groups of Europe, because they were never, like in history, like close partners. And the Protestants can be very just prejudiced on any religious line anyway. That's like in the Reformation. That's another part for America, is that it was just so bloody and menial in Europe in late 1600s during the Reformation, that to just have breathing room religiously would have been huge, but also that snake came back to swallow its tail. Because it became menial again. Population of America, 1920. I hate it when it defaults on Yahoo because it gives me the wrong answer every time, guaranteed. Okay, so 4 million out of 100 million were active clan members, and then they would, of course, had the ones who were completely silent, and actually might have operated above those clan members, just to think of strategy and their vie for power and control generationally. So their profits rolled in from the sale of their membership, regalia, costumes, publications, and rituals. So they'd have parties. Birth of a Nation was shown by the Democratic President Woodrow Wilson in the 1920s regularly. And then, as the Texas senator said in 2020 on the House floor, the Democratic Party would have clan bakes annually in upstate New York, last being published in 1964. And then probably still happening because it never ended, formally or otherwise. So the burning cross became the symbol of the new organization, and white-robed Klansmen participated in marches, parades, and nighttime cross burnings all over the country. To the old Klan's hostility towards Blacks and the new Klan, which was strong in the Midwest as well as in the South, added bias against Roman Catholics, Jews, foreigners, and organized labor. The Klan enjoyed a last spurt of growth that I disagree with in 1928, when Alfred E. Smith, a Catholic, received the Democratic presidential nomination. And this is after Coolidge, by the way, Republican. You should look up his speeches because he's kind of alluding to that domestic terrorist cell in his 1924 tax speech. He says, what's up with these billions of dollars locally? Because this is the Fed in small town America. Where are you getting all that cash and what are you planning to do with it? This is 1924 tax speech. Stupendous sum. Okay, so we have the Great Depression. A lot of members are not into it anymore because they can't eat clamshells or have as much food, I guess. Just speaking to the starvation and the Great Depression. So apparently they temporarily disbanded the year World War II ended, 1944. And then for the next 20 years, the Klan was quiescent. I don't know what that word means. Marked by inactivity or repose. Marked, yes, they were very marked by inactivity and repose. But it had a resurgence in some southern states because Jim Crow comes out. I think that's, if anything, that seems like a part of the Klan faction wanting to be honest and say, hey, because that whole time of Jim Crow, there are the quiet cells in the North and throughout, mainly the North. So LBJ apparently publicly denounced them on TV in the late 1800s. Except for then he did the Welfare Act, which enslaved blacks to the federal government, very intentionally encouraged reliance on the government and gave incentive for slavery, which sounds like a publicist wrote that idea because it's so gosh darn convincing. Okay, and then it does. The article about the KKK on Britannica does end with, I'll do the final paragraph. Despite the persistence of racism, the Klan, but for power and control, and I feel that has to be in there. Vato, what are you saying modern Mexicans are a mix of? I don't know. And then that would obviously be debated among Mexicans from different provinces. I would imagine you're saying native, white, and Spanish. I'm 0% Spanish. My grandma, for 500 years, her tribe eluded the Spanish, and then she met a Swedish man. And again, either way, it was slavery or he saved her from the genocide that was happening at that time. She immigrated to America with him. So don't forget about the Swedish Mexicans or the Chinese Mexicans. So again, the last paragraph on the KKK, as far as Britannica has published it. Despite the persistence of racism, the Klan largely failed to stem the growth of racial tolerance in the South in the late 20th century. Though the organization continued some of its surreptitious activities into the early 21st century, cases of clan violence became more isolated, and its membership had declined to a few thousand. The clan became a chronically fragmented melange made up of several separate and competing groups, some of which occasionally entered into alliances with neo-Nazi and other right-wing extremist groups, as was the case in the demonstration of Charlottesville, Virginia, August 2017, resulting in the death of a counter-demonstrator. So this lady, what's it called? What was the term used for people who were against, who weren't slaves but then fought against slavery? Not allies, but whatever that word is. Abolitionists. That's what I was looking for. So that's how Britannica ends it. Put my glasses on. Doctor's orders. Like a good one, not a KKK doctor. Yeah, so see in my notes if there's anything I wanted to rant about today. Mr. 33 Vato. Okay, we did Reconstruction failures. So the Reconstruction failure is just there wasn't a good check and balance put on the Democratic Party, KKK, and all of its secular enterprises and means of production and foreign allies. There was no check and balance. 1944 didn't end World War II, and then people were like, oh yeah, let's put a check and balance on the KKK. No, that didn't happen. And then it just still has never happened. So Reconstruction failures, that's implied. And I'm sure some cities did way better than others. And I really look forward to going to the South and exploring that because I know that's true. And I've seen a fair enough of footage of American cities and like just common circumstances to see how race relations are different than they are in the North. And I'm sure some southern cities suck, but I'm also excited to see those because I like knowledge. And so we did Reconstruction failures, crossed out. Definitely we'll do more on that later. This is where I land today. Adults talking openly and honestly about racism in America. Did it. That's what I'm doing these videos. Kind of carrying off from how quiet I was almost a decade ago. Well, a decade ago. 2014. I started doing Girl Power at the YWCA. Talking about race and being honest about tyrannical enterprises, the Democrat Party, KKK, and some Republicans and other people, a part of those ethnic groups, in fact. So we did that. History of slavery and then evolutions of racism. We talked about evolutions of racism with Darwin. We'll cross that out. History of American slavery. The Irish women were breeding slaves. So they were the first slaves in America. And then slavery and indentured servitude literally existed for every position, ethnic group, almost every enterprise in America in some form. The periods at which it was nastiest, mixed with the racism and ideas of superiority, were, like Britannica said, like isolated particular regions. But it was more common that it happened across the board as far as just basic slavery, not getting paid for labor, and then no end for freedom. And yeah, so we can cross that out. Britannica, they talked about Democratic presidents being in the KKK. They didn't say anything specifically about the DNC as a whole. And they did not reference in 2020, like they did with 2017, the Texas senator who testified on the House floor, no, in the North, you've been doing clam bakes until 1964, and that was the last one on record. Long pause. So Britannica did not mention that from 2020. And, it's really hard to find that video on YouTube now. So it's, unless I saved it in my file. Actually, let me see. In my playlist, I mean. Didn't see it in my playlist. It's like, what is clan bakes, excuse me. Is clan bakes spelled with a C or a K? I will remember the senator's name at some point because I have like the photo in my head. But was a senator who I don't see often. Like nobody else was on the floor that day. So it was during 2020. Let me see. John Cornyn. No, it's not that guy. So. Nope, I will remember who did it. Such a good clip. And it could have been taken down. I don't know. To end on the Great Society Act then. That should be good for the day. We'll do Britannica as well. That's actually a hilarious irony if that turns out to be more and more true, that even after the Protestant Reformation, bloody battles in Europe, early 1700s, late 1600s, then America, freedom, self-determination, liberty, and then people just go right back to that Protestant mindset that was like so constricted and unfree, but only do it in the guise of freedom. So they just get like a little bit closer to that real intended ideology, but they just can't give up like their Protestant mind frame because that's like so embedded in them. That would be a funny satire movie, like just the American Protestant. And it's like a real awkward evolution. And there's some super evil characters, but then there's also just so really like innocently dumb characters that are like trying to rationalize what they've been taught with like things that contradict it, but that they know is more closer to the truth. Oh man. So funny. And don't get me wrong, like, so my grandma's very Dutch on my dad's side, Miss Aletha Allen, her maiden name Vogelaar. She's half Dutch, and just the coldness, the brutally cold attitude, and just like the way they are is a lot of that. Even my mom's mom, more like she was a different kind of, that was a Swedish Mexican one. Just like the intense, constricting stubbornness in any mindset that they have. And it is like life and death with their identity. And they kind of were both similar that way. One is still alive. The gal Aletha is still alive. My other grandma died last April. She and the Queen of England went to Protestant hell together. They're both terrible women, and that's how I choose to see those realities. So they're in a Protestant hell right now where it's like there's not even pastries available. Okay. It's funny mourning somebody who you can still respect for teaching you some skills, but who you don't share love for. But to mourn that person, it's interesting. I've been mourning my grandma for a year. It's been an awkward mourning. Okay, so. And I actually still might write my other grandma, Aletha. I'm going to wait to do a better research paper than the one I sent her. Just being like, hey, if I die, like, you were wrong. But also because of their like strict mindset, I don't know how much my grandma knew. So I do want to have her be in as a witness, but I also want to like write her because I'd just be curious if she would write me back, you know? All right, so this is the last piece of evidence for the Democratic Party still having to answer for their I guess affiliation, connection with the KKK of the current era. So, Great Society, political slogan used by President Lyndon B. Johnson, 1963 to 69. And again, the clan bakes from the Texas Senate were on the menu till 1964. So the DNC at large was the champion of these clan bakes in upstate New York and other places because they had all factioned out. So they all had their own tradition and way of life. And So this is in his knowledge as president in 1963 to 69, and to identify his legislative program of national reform, Protestant. Previous, just they're always Reformation, it's like the Dutch can't stop it with Reformation. And I want to go there. And I'm like, what hurts? Tell Erica what hurts. What are you needing to reform? You know what I think? It's yourself. That's what you're needing to reform. Just look inside. Your heart is a tulip. Let it blossom and let it hide itself from the light as it needs to. That's what I would go to the homeland and say. I definitely am going to, you know what? Okay, my present to myself, 3-3 Vato, for when I graduate is to go visit my great-grandmother's homelands, because I don't have a connection to any immediate family. And so my ancestry is extra important to me. So I was already planning Mérida, Yucatan. And now, like, oh my God, I have to do it back to back. I have to do my great-great-grandmother on my mother's side, and from Annie, whatever her name was. Again, I think there were two. Mérida, Yucatan, nonetheless. And then on my dad's side, Aletha's mom from Holland, or wherever this Dutch woman was from. I don't know, but then I'll go to her homeland. She actually might have lived in England, now that I'm remembering something my grandma told me. So yeah, I do Mérida, Yucatan, and then wherever my other grandma's grandma was from. That's what it's going to be. Okay, that's something to be really excited about, actually, because I've been pretty depressed. All right. So I'm going to start this page over. Britannica, Great Society. Great Society, political slogan used by U.S. President Lyndon B. Johnson, served 1963 to 1969 to identify his legislative program of national reform. Previous 20th century U.S. chief executives, or the press, had provided slogans or nicknames for the major presidential policy initiatives, for example. Theodore Roosevelt introduced the square deal. Woodrow Wilson. Come on, can everybody else please teach their kids better, so when other people like me go to college, we can have real conversations about reality? Theodore Roosevelt introduced the square deal. Woodrow Wilson, the new freedom. Ew. Look into that one later. Franklin D. Roosevelt, the New Deal. Harry S. Truman, the Fair Deal. Oh my God, the Dutch hurts. Oh, my freedom, it's in a box. And John F. Kennedy, the New Frontier. Oh my God. In his first State of the Union message after election in his own right, delivered January 4th, 1965, Johnson proclaimed his vision of a great society and pledged to redouble the war on poverty, which started with Theodore Roosevelt. The war on poverty. I mean, and separately, not knowing their exact involvement in hate and that stuff, separately you wonder, because that's pretty honest to say the war on poverty, and America kept indebting itself and then ripping people off. All the different groups and factions would do it. So that's kind of ballsy now for the first guy, and then everybody else copied him in a different way. But for Theodore Roosevelt, we'll actually then, if we're doing the end state, we'll go back to the square deal and then end with that. Because if this was inspired from that, then we'd want to note back to the origin. Okay. He called for an enormous program of social welfare legislation, including federal support for education, hospital care for the aged, through an expanded Social Security program. and continued enforcement of the Civil Rights Act 1964, and elimination of the barriers to the right to vote. In describing his vision, Johnson said in part, "A great society rests on abundance and liberty for all. It demands an end to poverty and racial injustice, to which we are totally committed in our time." Interesting. That was my word. But that is just the beginning. The great society is a place where every child can find knowledge to enrich his mind and to enlarge his talents. It's a place where leisure is a welcome chance to build and reflect, not a fear cause of boredom and restlessness. It is a place where the city of man serves not only the needs of the body and the demands of the commerce, but the desire for the beauty and the hunger for community. That was LBJ describing his vision. Secular, secular, secular. Academia, academia, academia. Lonely child, lonely child, lonely child. I bet he liked Darwin. And I'm not judging, I'm just relating the patterns in which they think. Obviously, a grotesque version of Darwin. All right, a majority of the new Congress elected with Johnson in a Democratic landslide. Cool. They all shared the president's vision. Wouldn't you know it? They all thought the same thing and enacted on those same thoughts. That's crazy. And then the KKK party just vanished in thin air. Nobody was held on trial. There was no Supreme Court case apart from just the right to vote, black kids going to white schools. But there was no case against a certain terroristic group. Get what I'm saying, 3-3 Vato and future viewers? So yeah, they all shared the same vision. They said, "Great, I just planted a bunch of wheat in North Africa." Right on schedule. Or Ukraine, which is more accurate to 64, not the beginning of the 1900s. That was the beginning of the 1900s American accent. I can't do a 1964 very well. Okay. All right. Carrying on with the article. Social welfare program. Don't think about it too hard, because you might have a question. Of a variety of governmental programs designed to protect citizens from the economic risks and insecurities of life. Oh my God. The most common types of programs provided: benefits to the elderly or retired, the sick or invalid, dependent survivors, mothers, the unemployed, the work injured, and families. Methods of financing and administration and the scope of coverage and benefits vary widely among countries. I wonder if they meant to say counties. That's Britannica just preempting you for the UN. Wait, post-empting you. A brief treatment of welfare and security programs follows. For full treatment, see social service. The earliest modern social welfare laws were enacted in Germany in the 1880s. As similar programs have been adopted in other countries, the trend has been towards more comprehensive coverage in terms of both eligibility requirements and the nature of the risks insured against. Goddamn. A floor of minimum protection has come to be viewed as one of government's general responsibilities with respect to specific risks, and in many countries in consensus holds the public responsibility holds that the public responsibility extends to all those unable to care for themselves for whatever reason. In this view, social welfare is extended and received as a matter of right than of need. And that is, again, those publicists. It's like control the narrative, juggle, 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 juggle. So, because there's nothing related to the Declaration of Independence in that entire plan for the social framework of our country. So, excuse me if that was loud, Vato. I did not mean for that clap to be so loud. Then, of course, it degrades every society it affects, and that is just a result of welfare today. And it degraded the country as a whole. Real nasty enterprise, and it's destroyed our country, opportunity, and then the ability for people who enter welfare to ever leave it successfully. So it's an absolute monster. So that's another thing. Again, the BLM group, you got those billions of dollars that you've never received. You haven't grown the Black community in any substantial way since 2020. And I would say, you should probably argue welfare out of Congress and in some similar way accuse indentured servitude or slavery to the Democratic Party at large. That's just my recommendation as a citizen observing, as a granddaughter of a genocide attempt against one of her racial groups, my Yucatecan grandmother. That is that's my recommendation. So, and then I said, viewer, that we would go back to what this was all inspired by, and that is the Franklin Roosevelt Sr. Just seems like he had a sense of humor, the square deal. Okay, and we'll end there. It was a good talk about racism in American history. Thank you for joining me on this adventure of true justice and things that actually need to be fucking debated on the Senate and House floor. Mwahahaha. Okay, food for thought here. So Britannica, the square deal. Description by U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt, 1901 to 1909, of his personal approach to current social problems and the individual. It embraced Roosevelt's idealistic view of labor, citizenship, parenthood, and Christian ethics. That's what they needed in 1900 after the failure of the Gilded Age. Ideas. Roosevelt first used the term following the settlement of a mining strike. Excuse me. Wait, I gotta play devil's advocate here because as the train is blowing its horn where I'm at, Mr. James Hill, my favorite railway magnate in American history, he said hold on, that one is on my phone actually. Oh, let me show you a picture. No, never mind, it froze out of it. The wealth of the country, its capital, its credit, must be saved from the predatory poor as well as the predatory rich. and above all, from the predatory politician. And so he's late 1800s as well. Think what you will there. I love that quote, and it is so true. So Roosevelt first used this term, the square deal, following a settlement of a mining strike in 1902. So the same epithet era for that quote, or the same, whatever, to describe the ideal of peaceful coexistence between big business and labor unions. And these men are not acting just to be paid fairly, or all men vie for power and control in their own ideals. That's a given. So, and then they're going to follow suit of whoever is in, hierarchy. They're not thinking of what the larger consequence will be for their grandchildren. Men aren't thinking that way at this time, obviously. Some are. Thank God for you guys. So lovely. So he's in this mining strike, describing the ideal peaceful coexistence between big business and labor unions. The square deal concept was later largely incorporated into the platform of the Progressive Bull Moose Party when Roosevelt was its candidate in 1912. That is delightful. Yeah, so just I actually have a personal opinion, and my viewer, you might be mad at me. I'm not mad because so you have freedom, you have self-determination. You can the Homestead Act in 1865. You can just go pick land, build on it. The only place in the world you can do that is America at that time. For the most part today, I don't know how that law lives today. I look forward to learning about that. Can I go pick land? And then if I have a weapon where nobody else can take the square that I'm on, do I get to stay there because you can't take it away from me? Is that how you win land in America today? I don't know. Or if you just get away with hiding there for long enough. You're like, no, I buried myself here 5 years ago and I made it breathing through a straw. I don't know how the Homestead Act lives today. But back to the labor thing. So sometimes to build capital, you need promised labor. That's just a fact. If you wanted to, let's say, be a part of the railway industry, and you knew you might not get paid for a season until you made a profit from what you produced or transported, you would work maybe just getting fed and housed that season. Is that a form of slavery? Well, what's your better option at that time? Because things don't exist yet. People need to create them to exist. Capital needs to be built. And so, like a lot of the wealthy Americans were very poor for a very long time. And the irony was when their business thrived and then their workers were having to live through that poverty, a lot of the workers just couldn't accept that reality. And then they saw the owner as like the tyrant, even though it wasn't the case. Sometimes it was, but other times it was like, for example, this is where I am in Minot, North Dakota, is a place where James J. Hill built out his railway. The guy who said, and I'll read it again, if not only for myself. No, for everybody. So this guy, The wealth of the country, its capital, its credit, must be saved from the predatory poor as well as the predatory rich, but above all from the predatory politician. So these are people, and he built himself up as well. These are people who might seem like they're in a tyrannical position, but all actually sometimes it's like that whole working class group who's like, oh, we're not going to work, and doesn't see actually how damaging that is. And the fact that like, no, like how to build wealth, it's like a foreign concept to these people. And they think, they get paranoid and they're like, no, well, he'll have to give us everything if we don't do anything because it's the North and everybody will die if they don't, ha 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 ha. And like, that's a lot of how the union groups thought and operated, like hostage scenarios, threatening lack of needed supplies for for basic survival, and definitely in the North. And then above all, the predatory politician. So the person who could control and both those factions and other things with just like the bullshit, and then, you know, whatever else, because the politicians are just, again, a melting pot of all kinds of ideas and motives. So for that labor part, it's interesting that it is, and that's what this Britannica article, in my view, is saying, is that the president was literally being the negotiator between the unions and then the people who became wealthy off of industry strategy, making alliances with other people. Because eventually James J. Hill had to befriend Rockefeller, or they couldn't finish the railway, and likely people were going to freeze or starve to death in the North because those cities had already sprung up and the winters used to be extra brutal and extra long. And yeah, so it's funny that this article is saying for the square deal that it was literally to negotiate with large groups of people in organized labor who got drunk off of petty power and control. And then, of course, some people do the racism part because they have to feel good about themselves. And then they lie to themselves and call themselves patriots. And then there's normal people who don't know what's going on. There's people just trying to stick to the skill. And then it evolves into a lot of what we say today because it never ended, hasn't really been addressed. So thank you for being with me through this timeline. And we'll say we ended it in 1969 with the end of LBJ. No, we can just end it in modern era, I guess, because you can observe what I just talked about all around you, just basic observation. And if you've ever been on welfare and then you've been able to get off of it, you do get punished for getting off of it. You get punished financially. And it's not like it encourages you to go back to work. And it's funny because I was reading in Fox News this morning that they're having hearings for people who are on welfare to have to promise hours at work or to, complete hours of work. And it's funny how they'll debate that because now I think hopefully people who didn't notice do notice, like, oh my God, like if you get a certain amount and if you work 10 more hours that week, like, oh, I'm going to become more financially independent, you will get punished on your welfare for those 10 hours. So you might even get like 0 and then your income will set you back. So it'll be interesting to see what the welfare debates starting, I guess, in whatever committee we'll talk about. So I'll probably log back in to maybe talk about that again. All right, audience, thank you for being with me. It's been real.